Welcome to this video about credible sources. I'm Justin Rempel. We are going to be talking about what is a credible source, how do I know when I find one, and why should I bother using them? So first things first, we got to do definitions. What's a source? What makes it credible or not? When I'm talking about sources, I'm talking about reading and doing research, okay? And a source is a place where people can get information from. So we could be talking about a lot of different things when we say a source. We could be talking about another person. If I am in conversation with someone else and they tell me some facts and I quote them later, that other person is my source. I could be reading a book, that could be my source. I could be looking on a website, I could be reading a news article, I could be watching a video, I could be reading a social media post, could be my source of information. I could be referring to an email or a letter, a memo, even personal observation, right, can be a source. I saw something happen and I report it, my personal observation. Now I'm that source of information. It's important to distinguish between primary and secondary sources when we're talking about this. A primary source is an original source. It's where the information is first documented or observed. It's where things start, okay? So if I'm talking about a primary source, that's the original source of information. Primary sources are very valuable to have because you're getting to the root of the information network or relay. A secondary source is everything that happens afterwards. A secondary source depends on other sources for its information. So it's going to be referring to primary sources or even other secondary sources. When we're using sources, the goal is to make sure that our sources are credible. What do I mean when I say credible? I mean that something is believable and realistic, I believe, or I mean that something is legitimate. Credible means a good source, a source that is correct, that we can trust, that is accurate to the best of our knowledge. Misinformation. There is so much misinformation that is being spread. Misinformation is information that is false, just straight up wrong, inaccurate. It could also be information that is partially incorrect. Some parts of it are true, some parts of it are suspect. And much misinformation is sort of a hybrid blend of some things that are kind of true and some things that are kind of not. More and more, our sources of information are susceptible to flaws. And this is because of the speed with which we are sharing and passing along information now, thanks to digital technologies. It also has to do with the access to information. So anyone can share information. And that means that people are going to make mistakes, whether intentionally or accidentally. People are going to create information in which they're not experts, so they don't really know what they're talking about. Sometimes people create misinformation to be funny. They're doing it as a joke or a prank. But it gets passed along and misunderstood as actual factual information. Sometimes people create misinformation with malice. They want to actually do harm to others or create misunderstanding and confusion. This is why it's so important to be careful. Another factor is the speed of information that we have nowadays. On digital technologies, it gets shared and posted and created very, very quickly. So that means information can very quickly become outdated and inaccurate, and mistakes can be passed along or created in the transferal, kind of like playing the game of telephone, where a chain of people pass messages along to one another, and the message becomes garbled and confused and mixed up over time. It's exactly what happens when we're sharing information. It can turn into misinformation, even if it didn't start out that way. So when we're doing reading and researching and reporting, we want to make sure that we're using a source that is credible, that is legitimate. How do we tell? Well, we need to use the ABCs of credibility. These three criteria really tell us whether we're using a good, credible source or not. The A is for authority, the B is for basis, and the C is for currency. We're going to take a look at each one of these three factors and break down what it means. The A is for authority. So we want to consider the author of the source. That's the person who wrote or created the information. Is this person an expert in a relevant field? Okay, so do they know what they're talking about? Do they have training in that area? And sometimes you get an expert talking in a different field that they're actually not trained in. We want to know if the author is an expert in the field that's actually pertaining to the information. What qualifications does the author have? Okay, what kind of training or education have they received that would make them a legitimate voice in this area? Are we talking about an individual person or an organization putting out this information? If we're talking about an organization, is that organization a respectable and legitimate organization? Do they have a history of accuracy or inaccuracy, expertise or guesswork? Would they have any reason for bias on this issue? Bias means that you're really, you have a tendency to take one side of things, and so you're not going to get a fair representation or view. Do we see any evidence of bias in the source, or does it present all sides fairly? These are the things we want to consider when we're thinking about the author of the source. What sort of authority, credibility, expertise do they bring to the table? The B is for basis. When we're thinking about a source, we want to think about where that source got its information. What is the basis of the information they're providing? Where is the information coming from? Is it coming from a primary original source, or is it coming from a secondary source? If it's coming from other sources, does it properly cite its sources so that we can kind of follow that trail and check out the other sources? Are those sources credible? And does the information agree with other credible sources? It's a really good idea, if you're not sure about some information, that you compare it to other sources and you check and see if other sources agree or disagree. The C is for currency. And I actually don't mean the money, I mean time. How current or up to date is the information? Does the source include the date and or time of publication? Really, a legitimate source should tell you the time that it was posted or written. Does the source include the date and or time of any updates? Do you have a timeline of changes or revisions? More and more we're seeing articles or posts that include a little note that says last updated, and then it'll give you a date and a time. That's really helpful because you know exactly how current and how relevant this information is. A big thing to think about when you're considering currency is what type of information you're working with. Is the field of information subject to change? So if you're researching World War II, well, that's a field of history, and there might be new opinions or research that's done in that field, but it is a historical event, so updates on World War II are not going to be changing every few minutes, right? That's very different than if you're looking at a current news story that is actually live and unfolding as we speak, because then minute-to-minute updates are actually going to be really, really important. So do we care how new or how recent the information is for this topic that we're looking at? Is the information old or out of date is really the thing that we want to consider and try to find out. Is this information new enough to be good and credible, or is it actually outdated and there's newer, better information out there? If there is, we should look at those sources instead. So tips and pointers for trying to find credible sources. Lots of people have questions about Wikipedia. Wikipedia is an online encyclopedia and anyone can edit it. In general, it's a good source of starting information. Most of the information on there is legitimate and valid. However, sometimes people post misinformation to be funny or by accident. And so it is slightly untrustworthy. A really good way to use Wikipedia is as a starting point, because Wikipedia articles always have lots of sources and footnotes at the bottom. So you can read a Wikipedia article to get a general idea about your topic, scroll to the bottom, and you'll see hyperlinks to all sorts of other really good primary and secondary sources. Social media is generally unreliable, especially if you're doing a formal research report. This is not a good source to be pulling from. Often, if you're tracking live news, things will initially break on Twitter or platforms like that. But if you're doing a serious formal research report, this is not a good place to get your information from, especially because they're personal accounts often, and anyone can post on there, whether they're an expert in the field or not. Check with your teacher. Sometimes your teacher is going to have lists of recommended sources or guidelines for good, credible sources. So if you're unsure, they might know whether information is accurate or not, or whether a source is valid or not. And if you're in doubt, look elsewhere for confirmation, or just find alternatives, right? If you're not sure, you don't have a good feeling about a source, use a different one, or confirm, check a bunch of other sources to see if the information matches. Last tip, beware April Fool's Day. Every year on April 1st, a lot of fake news gets posted to be funny, as a joke, because it's a day when we prank each other and fool each other. So if you see a news article from April 1st of any year, generally regard it with suspicion and treat it as a comedic piece, not a serious piece.